All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to be leaning on the academic insights of Professor Joseph Liow to totally bust some major geopolitical myths. We often look at global conflicts as these distant, abstract chess games played by superpowers. But the reality on the ground, it's driven by deep histories and intense cultural pride. So we're going to look closely at what's really driving the decisions of major players like the US, China, and Iran, and ultimately why this macro-level maneuvering literally dictates the everyday survival of smaller nations. To keep things structured, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at geopolitics through cultural lenses. Then, China's global superpower dilemma. Third, the myth of U.S. decline. And finally, why small states must care.
Section 1. Geopolitics through cultural lenses, and specifically, the myth of the rational state. We're kicking off by reframing how countries actually make decisions, because, spoiler alert, it is rarely just about pure logic or economics. At the end of the day, we live in what academics call an anarchic world. Basically, that means every nation is ultimately on its own for survival and defense. You can make all the international friends you want, right? But security is on you. Every state naturally wants to maximize its power to survive. But here's the catch. How they go about it and how their neighbors react to it is filtered completely through their own unique historical and cultural lenses. Just look at the massive disconnect recently with Iran. The U.S. decision-makers essentially gambled that putting immense external pressure on Iran would cause the public to rise up and support regime change. But they completely missed the Iranian reality. Iran has this deep-rooted nationalism and a massive, proud civilizational history. When a nation like that feels attacked from the outside, they don't splinter. The citizens historically rally together, completely overriding their own internal political divides.
Professor Liow actually hit the nail on the head here. He pointed out that when former President Trump casually talked about the total annihilation of Persian civilization, well, that touched an incredibly raw nerve in Iran, even if you were part of the opposition, because casually threatening a nation's ancient identity absolutely destroys any chance you had of winning over their internal critics. Nationalism is for sure one of the most underestimated forces in geopolitics today.
Now, you might be wondering, if the Middle East is this volatile and complex, where is Beijing in all of this? Why isn't China, the rising superpower, stepping in to fix it? Which brings us to Section 2, China's global superpower dilemma, or as I like to call it, the reluctant hegemon. As the old saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. Historically, China has really preferred to just sit on the sidelines as a bystander to global conflict, focusing purely on economic win-wins. But here's the reality check. Playing the great power game requires taking on some seriously complicated political responsibilities. You can't just engage in global trade and turn a blind eye to security dynamics if you want to be recognized as a true global superpower. And man, China is in a serious pickle here. Looking at the numbers, they have historically friendly political relations with Iran. But materially, their trade volume and massive investments in Gulf states like the UAE completely dwarf what they have going on in Iran. So if a conflict shuts down the Straits of Hormuz, it massively hurts China's bottom line. They're caught right in the middle, forced to quietly navigate between these conflicting allies. But how does China handle external pressure? Well, it creates this fascinating cycle. When the U.S. tries to cut off China's access to international tech, the Chinese often just become completely independent, self-sufficient innovators. For instance, when the U.S. banned China's collaboration on the International Space Station back in 2011, China recognized their vulnerability to this American switching off game. So what did they do? They just rapidly developed their own state-of-the-art alternative, the Tiangong Space Station. And we're seeing this exact same dynamic play out right now with advanced semiconductors. So if China is rapidly advancing and innovating on their own, does that mean the American empire is finally collapsing? That's the narrative dominating the news cycle, right? But we really need to look closer at the reality of the situation.
Let's tackle that in Section 3, the myth of U.S. decline, wounded but unmatched.
It is so easy to buy into the idea of American decline, but writing off the U.S. is a huge mistake. Sure, other nations have the bells and whistles, but America has a battle-hardened military with tried and tested equipment. Their military doctrines, they're proven in actual combat, not just in theory. Plus, they have this incredibly deep reservoir of global influence. I mean, think about it. When the US announces global tariffs, countries literally line up at the White House to negotiate. Combine that with unparalleled innovation in their private sector and university ecosystems, and you've got a superpower that is absolutely unmatched.
However, keeping an impartial look at the source material here, the US is absolutely dealing with some severe self-inflicted wounds. We're talking about policies that alienate brilliant immigrant scientists, erratic and unpredictable trade tariffs toward their own allies, and a highly centralized, personality-driven decision structure. All of this is actively jeopardizing decades of accumulated global goodwill. And because of this unpredictability, global partners are quietly looking to diversify. We used to hear all about the China plus one strategy, right? Well, now there's a shift toward a US plus one strategy. Due to rising US protectionism, countries and companies are actively seeking alternative tech and markets. It's basically like buying an insurance policy, just in case the US suddenly changes the rules of the game. But here's the real question. When these giants wrestle, enact tariffs, and block vital waterways, who really pays the price? That brings us to our final part, Section 4. Why small states must care, the ripple effect. Let's look at how this macro-level maneuvering dictates everyday survival. Take the Straits of Malacca. To the international community and neighbors like Singapore, it's just a critical, shared international transit lifeline that has to remain open. But if you look through Indonesia's cultural lens, they view those straits as sovereign internal waters bound by the archipelagic state principle. This brilliantly illustrates why you absolutely have to understand the historical perspectives of your neighbors. To Indonesia, controlling those waters is an existential matter of national unity, not just a convenient trade route. And when you map out the timeline, it makes total sense. From 1945 to 1949, Indonesia fought a bloody revolution against the Dutch for liberation. Then in 1957, Prime Minister Juanda declared the archipelagic principle. And by the early 1960s, during the West Arian crisis, external forces literally used Indonesian waters to undermine the country's interests. So yeah, it becomes incredibly clear why Indonesia is fiercely protective of its waters. They view almost any international presence as a potential colonial threat. Professor Liow sums this up perfectly. We don't have the luxury of shutting off our borders. We are very dependent on what's happening outside. For small states, tracking these global shifts isn't just some fun academic exercise. It is a matter of absolute survival. They are at the total mercy of energy spikes and closed trade routes from conflicts they have zero involvement in. Consider this wild hypothetical. If the United States were to suddenly pack up and leave Asia tomorrow, what exactly would a country like Japan do while surrounded by nuclear-armed rivals? This single question perfectly highlights why even nations that frequently criticize the US still desperately want them to remain engaged. Without that security umbrella, the resulting arms race would be terrifying for everyone involved. At the end of the day, international law is vital, but it does not trump raw power. Its effectiveness relies entirely on the superpowers who are actually willing to enforce it, which leaves us with this final, striking reality to ponder. In a world where global rules only exist if superpowers agree to them, how prepared are you to navigate the cultural lenses driving their next moves?